Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be discussing the various types of sentences, the syntactically appropriate sentence forms, and some of the most common errors, or at least one of the most common errors, that results in the failure to properly structure sentences based on these types. Remember that we discussed clauses and phrases, and that the simplest kind of clause included both a subject and a properly conjugated verb. That kind of clause makes for, in essence, a simple sentence. A simple sentence contains a subject and a verb. Now, some sentences can have simply that, the boy runs. However, usually most simple sentences also include what is known as the object of the sentence. So the boy runs to the store. There'd be an object of that sentence. Or the boy throws the ball. This simple sentence that includes just a single subject and a verb is the most basic form of sentence that you can develop in the English language, and it expresses a single complete thought that can stand on its own. Some examples of that. The baby cried for food. There's a subject and a verb that expresses a complete thought. For food is that predicate or the object of the sentence. It's what the baby cries for. But you have the subject and the properly conjugated verb. Now, simply because it is a simple sentence does not mean that the sentence itself cannot be somewhat, well, lengthy. I won't use the term complex because the complex sentence is a specific kind of sentence to be distinguished from the simple sentence. So another example of the simple sentence would be Professor Maple's intelligent students completed and turned in their homework. That too is a simple sentence. You have the subject, Professor Maple, and you have the properly conjugated verb. The subject would be Professor Maple's intelligent students, right? And then you have two verbs, completed and turned in, their homework. The object, that is what the verb is done to, or the object of the verb. Now, you can have more than one subject and more than one verb, or at least more than one noun or pronoun in the subject and more than one verb, and still maintain a simple sentence, because it expresses a single complete thought, and the two nouns or pronouns are together. So as an example, Megan and Ron ate too much and felt sick. Although there are two subjects and two verbs, it's still a simple sentence because both verbs share the same subject and express one complete thought. So if you have a single complete thought, a main verb, and a subject, you have a simple sentence. That is to be distinguished from the compound sentence. A compound sentence has two independent clauses. You'll notice here, this sentence, or, well, the clause that is also a sentence, is also an independent clause, right? It is one complete thought. A compound sentence is the fusion of two or more independent clauses. An independent clause is a part of a sentence that can stand alone as a complete thought with a grammatically correct subject-verb sort of combination. And the compound sentence contains at least two of these. They're joined together by a coordinating conjunction. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. A sentence can never begin with one of these coordinating conjunctions. They indicate that you have one independent clause, and then you are attaching that independent clause using a coordinating conjunction and a comma to another independent clause. Examples. The shoplifter had stolen clothes, so he ran once he saw the police. The coordinating conjunction so implies both a relationship between the two ideas and the connection between two independent clauses. Right? There's a causal relationship in the case of the use of the word so. Both sides of the conjunction so are complete sentences. You could replace the so and the comma with a period, change the H to a capital, and then you would have two full sentences. But we wanted to indicate that there's a relationship between these two actions, a causal relationship between these two actions. So, as a result, we used so. Therefore, this is a compound sentence. They spoke to him in Spanish, but he responded in English. This is also a compound sentence. And again, the specific choice of coordinating conjunction reveals the relationship between the ideas expressed in the first independent clause and the second independent clause. A complex sentence is an independent clause joined by one or more dependent clauses. Remember that a dependent clause has a subject and a verb, oftentimes, or it can have both of them, but doesn't express a complete thought, or it's a clause that lacks either a subject or a verb. Usually, you can identify the dependent clause when you notice that it has a subordinator or subordinating conjunction like as, because, since, after, although, or when, or a relative pronoun, who, that, or which. We haven't talked about relative pronouns, but there's a list there for you. A complex sentence takes that independent clause and attaches it to a dependent clause. So it takes the independent clause that could work as a sentence on its own, it's a complete thought, and it takes the dependent clause that is not and cannot work as a sentence on its own and joins them together. After eating lunch at the Cheesecake Factory, dependent clause, because of the subordinating conjunction after, Tim went to the gym to exercise. Independent clause. I could have this sentence or this part of the sentence working as a sentence on its own. However, this sentence does not. Because, well, first of all, it has a subordinating conjunction, and it also has no subject. It has an improperly conjugated verb, right? So the verb is not conjugated in the present tense, and there's no subject. Opinionated women are given disadvantages in societies that privilege male accomplishments. Now, the subject of this sentence is opinionated women, and the verb is are given. The first part of the sentence, opinionated women are given disadvantages in society, is an independent clause. That expresses a complete thought. This clause is a dependent clause that privileges male accomplishments. It's not a complete thought, but it uses the relative pronoun that to introduce something that adds information to what the society is by way of a dependent clause. The woman who taught art history to 10 was fired for stealing school supplies. This example is a little bit more complex. The dependent clause isn't nicely separated or segregated off from the independent clause. Rather, an independent clause is split up in the middle by a dependent clause. The independent clause here would be the woman was fired, or the woman was fired for stealing school supplies. Who taught art to 10 is a dependent clause. Who is one of those relative pronouns that introduces a dependent clause. If it's removed, you would just have the independent clause. Who taught art history to 10 is an adjective clause that provides necessary detail about the subject, woman. The compound complex sentence is a sentence that has at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. So it's a combination of the previous two types. Some examples. After the two soccer players lost their game, they joined their other teammates for lunch and they went to the movies. So we have the dependent clause after the two soccer players lost their game because it is set up with a subordinating conjunction. We have an independent clause, they joined their other teammates for lunch. And then we have a coordinating conjunction and another independent clause, they went to the movies. The man believed in the system, so independent clause, and he knew that justice would prevail, another independent clause, after the murderer was sent to jail, a dependent clause. Notice here that with the dependent clause, if the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, it has to be offset by a comma. However, the dependent clause can also come after the independent clause, right? If it does so, then you do not need the comma, right? The justice system would prevail, no comma, after the murderer was sent to jail. What I'd like you to do is to take a look at this worksheet that is posted on Omnibox, or simply pause the video here and answer this question, dividing up these sentences into their constituent parts, whether there are independent clauses, where the independent clauses are, where the dependent clauses are, and the like, and then identify whether this sentence is simple, complex, compound, or compound complex. Once you've done that, resume this video, and we will look at the grammatical error that I discussed, comma splices, based on these sentence types. So, the first of these grammatical errors that we're going to discuss is a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence is an error that happens when you have two independent clauses that are joined together improperly without any connection or punctuation. As an example, the narrator respects the importance of her father's work. She hates the kitchen responsibilities of her mother. Here, what we have are two sentences that are actually butted up against each other. We have two independent clauses that have been improperly joined together. At she hates, or work, she hates the kitchen responsibilities. Here, between work and she, there needs to be a period and a capital, or a comma and a coordinating conjunction. My cat adores sleeping. She takes a lot of naps. She is always tired. Here we have three independent clauses. that really should be reformed so that either they're independent sentences or they are developed together with coordinating and subordinating conjunctions, turning this into a compound or a complex or compound complex sentence or series of sentences. The comma splice is almost identical to the run-on sentence or the run-together sentence, but the difference is that the two independent clauses are separated by a comma. Like the run-on sentence, it's an error that occurs when independent clauses are joined together or placed back-to-back improperly. It occurs when you use a comma to separate two independent clauses without a conjunction. My cat adores sleeping. She takes a lot of naps. She is always tired. To fix that error here, I would have to say my cat adores sleeping. She takes a lot of naps and she is always tired. Or I could turn this into a compound complex sentence. My cat adores sleeping, so she takes a lot of naps because she is always tired. There are many different ways you could correct this grammatical error, but the point is that the issue is that we have independent clauses joined together improperly by use of commas. Always remember that a comma alone is never enough to link two complete thoughts, two independent clauses. If you have two separate subject-verb combinations, they must be properly linked in one of the four following ways. 4 ways to fix a comma splice. So just as a bit of a review, my cat adores sleeping. So we have one subject-verb combination for an independent clause. Then we have another subject-verb combination with she takes, and then another one, she is. So whenever you see more than one subject-verb combination like that, which means more than one independent clause, because an independent clause has that subject-verb combination, then you need to make sure that they're separated out properly, not just with commas, but with either periods and capital letters, or by way of coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. So, 4 ways to fix a comma splice. Use a period and a capital letter to separate the two independent clauses. Use a comma and a coordinating conjunction to separate two independent clauses. Use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses. Now, this one is difficult, and I would advise against it because the semicolon is a finer point of grammar. Now, the semicolon does separate two independent clauses, but it implies that there's some kind of connection between those two clauses logically.
And lastly, use a subordinating conjunction to create a dependent clause that attaches to an independent clause. Simplest way to fix this problem is to change the grammatical error into a series of simple sentences. This method creates two simple sentences. This problem could be corrected by saying that my cat adores sleeping, she takes a lot of naps. Use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. A comma followed by a coordinating conjunction, one of the 7 fanboys for an acronym for those different coordinating conjunctions, can successfully connect two independent clauses. Example, a comma splice. Her imagination changes, so she no longer daydreams about being an action hero. A correction. Her imagination changes, for she no longer daydreams about being an action hero. Or so she never no longer daydreams about being an action hero. Those two conjunctions imply a different meaning. The use of the semicolon. Now, the semicolon can work just like a period. It separates out independent clauses, but it separates out two closely related independent clauses. So those ideas are connected to each other in some way that doesn't require or that obviates the need for a period. Examples: Jane wants to help her community, she volunteers at the homeless shelter. Jane wants to help her community, semicolon, she volunteers at the homeless shelter. Or the use of the subordinating conjunction. Remember again that subordinating conjunctions imply logical relationships between the independent clause and the dependent clause that you have constructed. So, my cat adores sleeping, she takes a lot of naps. Because my cat adores sleeping, she takes a lot of naps. The subordinating conjunction because turns the first clause into a dependent statement, and now the two clauses can be connected with a comma. So you have here a list of subordinating conjunctions. Things to remember: you can never separate two independent clauses or two basic building blocks for simple sentences with only a comma. Never rush ahead in your next subject-verb combination without carefully considering and choosing which of the 4 options for connecting clauses you want to use. And if you want to review this concept in more detail, you can read through pages 26 to 28 of the Heritage College Grammar Guide. What I'd like you to do at this point then is to use the worksheet that I have provided to get some practice correcting run-on sentences or run-together sentences, and also comma splices. You can then complete the grammar quiz associated with this lesson and submit that to turnitin.com.